7 military doctors read his file. 7 doctors saw the words, "Retained projectile lower back requires surgical evaluation." 7 times from a muddy field in Normandy to a processing camp in Virginia, they checked his pulse, measured his temperature, wrote their notes, and moved him along. Condition stable, ambulatory, not an emergency. But when the 8th doctor clipped the X-ray film onto the light box on a November morning in 1944 at Camp Hearn, Texas, he stood completely still for a full minute. The bullet had moved, and where it was now, less than the width of a pencil from the spinal canal, was a position that turned everything from monitor to operate immediately, or this boy never walks again. But that is not the most surprising part. The most surprising part will only be revealed on the operating table when Major Edward Callahan pulls the bullet from the back of a 19-year-old German prisoner of war and realizes that the bullet did not come from an American gun. To understand how a German teenager ended up on an operating table in Texas with a bullet migrating toward his spine, we need to go back to the moment he grabbed the surgeon's wrist. Not gently, not politely, with both hands like a drowning man gripping a rope. The prisoner's name is Klaus Brandt. He is 19 years old. His face is pale and sheened with sweat. His left leg trembles visibly against the surface of the examination table, even though he is not moving it intentionally. He says in broken English 3 words he has clearly rehearsed during the entire transport from Europe. "Take it out." He says them again louder. "Take it out now." Major Edward Callahan has been the chief surgeon at Camp Hearn for 14 months. He has treated hundreds of German prisoners, broken bones, infected wounds, dysentery, dental abscesses, the ordinary medical catalog of men living in close quarters far from home. He has never had a prisoner grab him the moment he walked through the door. Callahan does not pull away. This is a detail worth noting because it reveals the kind of man he is. A different surgeon might have stepped back, might have called the guard, might have written in the file that the prisoner was agitated and needed sedation before examination. Callahan does none of these things. He looks at the grip on his wrist. He looks at the trembling left leg. He looks at the face of a boy who is watching his own body fail and who understands exactly what is happening to it. Callahan gently removes Klaus's hands from his wrist and says through the camp interpreter, Corporal Thomas Avery, "I hear you. I'm going to examine you thoroughly right now. Tell me everything from the beginning." But before we hear what Klaus tells him, you need to understand who Edward Callahan is and why what happens next will cost him more than a night's sleep. Callahan is 38 years old. He comes from a small town in Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner who never finished grade school. Callahan went to medical school on a scholarship and joined the Army Medical Corps in 1940 not because of burning patriotism, but because the Army paid off his student loans. He is a practical man, a man of procedures. His colleagues say he could suture a wound while drinking coffee with his free hand. His hands are the steadiest in Camp Hearn. But steady hands and specialized training are 2 different things, and Callahan has never performed a bullet extraction adjacent to the spinal cord. He knows this. He knows the limits of what he has done and the limits of what he can do, and until this morning, those 2 things have never been in conflict. There is something else about Callahan. He follows protocol, always. By the book is not just a phrase for him, it is a philosophy. When a medic on his staff suggested skipping a documentation step to save time, Callahan made the man redo the entire intake process from the beginning. Protocol exists because the human mind under pressure makes mistakes, and protocol is the fence that keeps those mistakes from falling off the cliff. Callahan believes this the way some men believe in God. But today protocol will fail him, because the correct protocol for a bullet 4 millimeters from the spinal canal is to transfer the patient to a specialized neurosurgical facility. The nearest one is William Beaumont General Hospital in El Paso, Texas, 500 miles away. 2 days by military transport, and in those 2 days the bullet can move, has been moving, is moving now fractions of a millimeter at a time toward the one structure in the human body that cannot tolerate a foreign object pressing against it. For the first time in 9 years of surgery, the right procedure might kill the patient, and breaking the procedure might save him. Callahan does not know this yet, not in this moment, but he will know it within the hour, and the decision he makes will follow him for the rest of his life. If stories like this matter to you, the kind that most history books never covered, hit subscribe. These stories deserve to be heard. Now, Klaus is talking and Avery is translating, and Callahan is listening. We need to go back to understand how this boy arrived in Texas with a bullet creeping toward his spine. We go back to July 1944, to Normandy, France, to the hedgerows near the town of St. Lo. The Battle of St. Lo was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire Normandy campaign. The fighting lasted from July 7th to July 19th, 1944, and it cost the American First Army more than 40,000 casualties in less than 3 weeks. The terrain was bocage country, ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a natural fortress. Earth mounds 3 to 12 feet high, topped with dense vegetation, enclosed small fields and sunken lanes. German defenders concealed positions behind every hedge, every stone wall, every drainage ditch. American forces advanced field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, measuring progress in yards and paying for each yard in blood. Klaus Brandt was part of the German 352nd Infantry Division, the same division that had defended Omaha Beach on D-Day barely 6 weeks earlier. By mid-July, the 352nd was a ghost of its former strength. Casualties had been staggering. Boys who had been in uniform for 3 months were now the veterans of their squads, because everyone who had been there longer was dead or wounded or captured. Klaus at 19 was one of the older soldiers still standing in his platoon. He had been in the Wehrmacht for 2 years. He had not volunteered. He had been drafted at 17, pulled from an apprenticeship in his father's watchmaking shop in Nuremberg before he could learn to regulate a mainspring. On July 18, 1944, the American forces finally broke through. The 352nd received orders to retreat. This was not an orderly withdrawal. This was a unit shattering under overwhelming firepower and tactical pressure, men running between positions under fire from infantry tanks and artillery. The hedgerow country that had protected the Germans for weeks now trapped them, funneling retreating soldiers into killing zones where American gunners had pre-registered their fire. Klaus was running in a low crouch between positions when he felt a sharp impact in his lower back on the left side just above the beltline. He staggered and fell. He lay still for 1 second, certain he was mortally wounded. Then he realized he could still feel his legs, still move them, still breathe without pain. The bullet had entered from the rear left side and stopped somewhere in the muscle and tissue of his lower back, without hitting the spine, the kidneys, or any abdominal organ. Here is a detail that matters more than it seems in this moment. The entry wound is on the left posterior lower back. The bullet entered from behind. Klaus was running toward German lines, not away from them. The fire was coming from multiple directions in the chaos of the retreat, but the bullet came from behind him. Klaus does not think about this now. He presses his hand against the wound, which is bleeding steadily, but not spurting, and he keeps moving. Because stopping in that field means dying in that field. A German medic treats him 2 hours later at a collection point. The medic cleans the wound, packs it with gauze, applies a pressure bandage, confirms the bullet is retained. No exit wound. Tags Klaus for evacuation to a field hospital for surgical removal. But before the evacuation happens, the unit is overrun. American infantry reaches their position the following morning. Klaus surrenders with 16 other survivors. An American medic notes the back wound and the retained bullet in Klaus's initial capture documentation. The file says retained projectile, lower left back, requires surgical evaluation. That notation travels with Klaus through 7 different processing points across 4 months without producing a single surgical evaluation. From a field collection point in Normandy to a transit camp in France. From France to a ship crossing the Atlantic. From the ship to a processing facility in Virginia. From Virginia to a train heading south to Texas. At each stop, a medic reads the file, sees that Klaus is mobile, and his vital signs are stable, and downgrades the case. Stable, ambulatory, not acute, move him along. But something Klaus tells no one, something he buries so deep he almost convinces himself it did not happen. In the chaos of that retreat near St. Lo, in the split second before he fell, Klaus turned his head, and in the muzzle flash of the surrounding gunfire, he saw something. A figure in a German uniform, not American, with a weapon pointed in his direction. The image lasted less than a second. It could have been shock. It could have been the confusion of a battlefield where fire comes from every direction. Klaus does not know if what he saw was real. He has never spoken of it. But the image sits in a locked room in his mind, and sometimes in the dark he hears it knocking. There is also a letter in Klaus's breast pocket. From his mother in Nuremberg, received at the Virginia processing facility, but not yet opened. Klaus has been saving it, not because he forgot, because reading your mother's words when you do not know whether you will walk tomorrow feels like a kind of promise he is not ready to make. We are back at Camp Hearn. The examination is complete. The X-ray technician, Corporal James Hadley, has taken front and lateral views of Klaus's lumbar spine and pelvis. The films are developed in 20 minutes. Callahan takes them to the light box in his office and clips them up. He stands in front of those films and does not move for a full minute. The bullet is a small, dense white object visible clearly on both views. It sits in the soft tissue of the left lower back at the level of the fourth lumbar vertebra. Callahan measures its position on the film with a ruler. The bullet is approximately 4 millimeters from the posterior surface of the spinal canal. 4 millimeters, less than the width of a pencil. What concerns Callahan even more is the trajectory visible on the lateral view. The bullet is angled slightly inward, and its nose pointing toward the spine rather than away from it. This means if the bullet moves at all, even fraction volume, it will move toward the spinal cord, not away from it. 4 months ago, this bullet may have been sitting at a safer distance. Now it is at the spinal margin, and it is trending inward. Callahan calls Captain Margaret Hollis, a neurologist, who rotates between several Texas POW camps. Hollis arrives within 2 hours. She examines Klaus systematically, spending 40 minutes on a detailed neurological assessment. Her findings confirm and extend Callahan's concerns. In addition to the left thigh numbness and diminished knee reflex, Hollis finds mild weakness in Klaus's left hip flexor, the muscle that lifts the thigh when walking. She grades it 4 out of 5. She also finds a subtle abnormality in Klaus's left ankle reflex. Hollis tells Callahan directly, "This is a progressive lumbar nerve root compression syndrome. The bullet is pressing on the fourth lumbar nerve root. The symptoms will progress as long as the compression continues. If the bullet moves further, he risks complete left leg paralysis, impossible loss of bladder, and bowel control." Callahan asks the question he already knows the answer to. Does he need surgery? Hollis says, he needed surgery 4 months ago. The question now is whether surgery is still possible without causing the very damage we are trying to prevent. And at that moment, Sergeant Raymond Pike appears in the doorway of Callahan's office with a message that turns a difficult situation into an impossible one. Private First Class Bobby Tanner, 20 years old, American soldier, compound femur fracture from a training accident 3 days ago, is still waiting for surgery. The camp hospital has 1 operating room, 1 surgical team. Callahan cannot operate on both patients at the same time. 1 operating room, 2 patients. 1 is a German prisoner with a bullet eating into his spinal cord. 1 is an American soldier with a broken femur who has been waiting 3 days. Callahan knows the correct medical answer, but the correct medical answer is not always the safest answer for the man who gives it. Before Callahan can schedule the surgery, Captain Vernon Slade walks into his office. Slade is the administrative officer at Camp Hearn, 44 years old, former combat veteran wounded in North Africa, transferred to administrative duty after Tunisia. In January 1944, Slade's eldest son David, a 22-year-old infantry lieutenant, was killed at Anzio, Italy. Slade received the notification while he was processing intake paperwork for a new batch of German prisoners. Since that day, Slade has done his job precisely, professionally, without violence, without violating the Geneva Convention. But he has one iron principle. American soldiers come first. Always. No exceptions. Slade is not a villain. He is a man with a legitimate reason for what he believes. Some viewers listening to this right now might agree with him. That is what makes him dangerous. "I hear you are planning to use the operating room for a prisoner tomorrow morning," Slade says. "Surgical emergency," Callahan says. "Bullet 4 millimeters from the spinal canal and migrating." Bobby Tanner has been waiting 3 days with a broken femur. He is an American soldier. Tanner's fracture is stable, painful but not progressing. Brandt's bullet is progressing every day. Slade is quiet for a moment. Then, "You are telling me a 19-year-old German gets surgery before a 20-year-old American. I am telling you a patient at risk of permanent paralysis within days gets surgery before a patient with a stable injury. That is medical triage, not politics." Slade looks at Callahan for a long time. "My son David lay at Anzio with shrapnel in his gut for 6 hours before a doctor reached him. 6 hours. And you are telling me the Germans who shot my boy Now get operated on before our own men. Callahan looks at Slade. He sees a father who lost a son, not an enemy, a grieving father standing in his office saying something that, from a certain angle, makes perfect sense. For 5 seconds, Callahan considers it. Just 5 seconds. Operating on Tanner first is easier, safer for his career. Nobody criticizes a surgeon who prioritizes American soldiers. And a compound femur fracture is a procedure he has done hundreds of times, not a bullet extraction adjacent to the spinal cord that he has never attempted. 5 seconds. Then Callahan remembers the trembling left leg, the way Klaus grabbed his wrist, the eyes of a 19-year-old boy watching his own leg die and understanding exactly what that means. Captain Slade, I do not operate on German soldiers or American soldiers. I operate on patients. And the Geneva Convention, which the United States Army is sworn to uphold, requires medical treatment based on severity, not nationality. Private Tanner will be operated on immediately after Brandt, same day if possible. But Brandt goes first. Slade looks at Callahan for a long time. Then he says very quietly, "You are a better man than me, Callahan." I do not know if that is a compliment or a criticism. He turns and walks out. No shouting, no threats, just walks out with the shoulders of a man carrying weight heavier than his body. Slade accepts Callahan's decision, but he does not forget. And in the weeks to come, Slade will find a detail in the surgical report, a small note about the caliber of the bullet that will change the way he sees Klaus Brandt completely, and change himself. That evening, Callahan calls William Beaumont General Hospital in El Paso and speaks by telephone with Colonel Frederick Davenport, Chief of Neurosurgery. He describes the case and the X-ray findings in detail. Davenport asks specific questions about the bullet's position relative to the pedicles of the fourth lumbar vertebra and the degree of scar encapsulation visible on the film. Callahan answers from the images in front of him. Davenport is quiet for a moment. Then he gives Callahan a detailed surgical approach. Posterior midline incision. Careful muscle splitting without retraction. Identification of the bullet using a sterile probe before grasping. Extraction in a single controlled movement along the bullet's long axis. Do not deviate from the long axis, Davenport says. That is the one direction that takes you away from the canal rather than toward it. Callahan writes every word down. He schedules surgery for the next morning. That night, Avery visits Klaus in the hospital ward at Callahan's request and explains the procedure step by step. The incision, the dissection, the extraction, the closure. Klaus listens carefully and asks the question Callahan expected. What are the chances the surgery makes his leg worse instead of better? Avery delivers Callahan's numbers exactly. 10 to 15% chance of additional neurological damage during surgery. Near certainty of progressive paralysis if the bullet is not removed. Klaus asks Avery to repeat the numbers. Avery repeats them. Klaus says 10 to 15% against certain harm if we do nothing. That is not a difficult decision. That is mathematics. Avery reports the exchange to Callahan, who is still reviewing the X-ray films and his notes from the call with Davenport. Callahan looks up. He said that exactly that. Yes, sir. Callahan is quiet for a moment. This boy is smarter than most of the staff here. Callahan pins the films back on the light box and stares at the white speck of the bullet sitting 4 millimeters from everything that matters. He has been a surgeon for 9 years. Hundreds of operations. But there is something about extracting a projectile from millimeters away from a young man's spinal cord in a camp hospital in Texas with no neurosurgical backup for a 19-year-old prisoner who grabbed his wrist and begged him the moment he walked into the room that makes Callahan sit at his desk at 10 o'clock at night and read Davenport's instructions again from the beginning. Not because he does not remember them, because he wants his hands to remember them. At the same time, Klaus lies on his bunk in the hospital ward. The familiar electric sensation runs through his left thigh, a buzzing numbness from hip to knee that has been getting worse for 3 weeks. He lies on his side, not on his back, because pressure on the bullet site sends pain radiating down both legs. He takes out the letter from his mother, opens it. Her handwriting is small and careful, the handwriting of a woman who knows that paper is scarce and words are rationed. She writes that the family is well, that his father's watch shop has fewer customers, but his hands are still steady, that Willie is apprenticing at a bakery near the Hauptmarkt, that the autumn has been cold and there is less cold than last year. She writes that she prays for him every night and that she does not know where he is, but she knows God does. She does not write about the war. She does not write about fear. She writes about the small, ordinary things that a mother writes to a son when the ordinary things are all she has left to give. Klaus reads the letter twice. Then he folds it carefully and holds it against his chest. Tomorrow, a man he met this morning will cut into his back and attempt to remove a bullet from 4 millimeters away from the nerve bundle that controls his legs. He might wake up with both legs working. He might wake up with neither. He lies on his side in a hospital bunk in Texas holding his mother's letter and listens to the sound of his own breathing, which is steady, and the sensation in his left leg, which is not. Tomorrow morning, Major Callahan will pick up a surgical clamp and pull a bullet from 4 millimeters away from a 19-year-old's spinal cord. But the bullet will reveal a secret that no one in that operating room expects. A secret that Klaus has sensed since that night in Normandy, but has never dared to face. The morning of the surgery arrives at Camp Hearn the way November mornings arrive in Central Texas. Cool air carrying the faint smell of mesquite and dry grass. A pale sun rising over flat land that stretches in every direction without interruption. The kind of morning that feels ordinary until you remember what is about to happen inside the camp hospital. Callahan is awake before dawn. He has slept perhaps 3 hours. Not because of anxiety, but because his mind kept returning to the lateral X-ray view, to the angle of the bullet's nose pointing inward toward the spinal canal, and to Davenport's instruction that keeps repeating in his head like a phrase of music he cannot silence. Do not deviate from the long axis. That is the one direction that takes you away from the canal rather than toward it. He shaves carefully, steadies his hands under warm water, flexes his fingers 10 times, a habit he developed years ago before complex procedures. His hands respond the way they always do. No tremor, no stiffness. Whatever doubts live in his mind, they do not reach his hands. This is the one gift Callahan trusts absolutely about himself. Before entering the surgical ward, Callahan stops at the bed of Private First Class Bobby Tanner. This is a decision he makes deliberately, not because protocol requires it, but because something in him needs to look at the American soldier who will wait while a German prisoner goes first. Tanner is awake, 20 years old, sandy hair, a farm boy's build, broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. His right leg is immobilized in a Thomas splint, the compound femur fracture stabilized, but not repaired. 3 days of waiting have carved shadows under his eyes. Doc, Tanner says, I hear you are operating on the German before me. Callahan meets his gaze directly. That is correct. His case is a neurological emergency. Your fracture is stable. You will be operated on this afternoon. Tanner is quiet. He looks at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Callahan. You sure he needs it more than me? If I do not operate on him today, he will be paralyzed. If I do not operate on you today, you will be in pain for several more hours. That is the difference. Tanner nods slowly. Then operate on him. But promise me you will not forget me this afternoon. I promise, Tanner. Tanner looks at Callahan a moment longer. Then he says something that Callahan will remember for years. Do a good job on him, Doc. If we are going to make them wait in line behind our guys, the least we can do is make sure the surgery is worth the wait. Callahan nods. He turns and walks toward the operating room. As he passes Tanner's bed, he is aware that he has just witnessed something quiet and significant. A 20-year-old American soldier with a broken leg in pain who has been waiting 3 days, who knows a German prisoner is being treated before him, and whose response is not anger, but a simple request that the surgery be done well. This is not dramatic. There is no speech, no flag waving. But it is the kind of moment that tells you something true about a person and about the values that person carries without knowing he carries them. The operating room at Camp Hearn is not a modern surgical suite. It is a converted barracks room with a wooden floor over headlights that buzz faintly in autoclave for sterilizing instruments and a single operating table. The equipment is adequate, but not generous. Callahan has performed every surgery at this camp on this table under these lights, with instruments that he maintains personally because he does not trust anyone else to ensure their precision. Klaus is brought in on a wheeled stretcher. He is calm. His face is pale but composed. His left leg trembles in its now familiar rhythm against the stretcher rail. He looks at the ceiling of the operating room, the way a man looks at the ceiling of a place where something will be decided about him that he cannot control. Captain Donald Marsh, the anesthesiologist, prepares the ether apparatus. Lieutenant Ruth Jennings, the surgical nurse, is already at the instrument table arranging clamps, retractors, probes, scalpels, and sutures in the precise order Callahan requires. Captain Margaret Hollis stands near the monitoring equipment. Her role is specific. She will not touch the surgical field. She will watch Klaus's vital signs for any change that might indicate spinal involvement during the procedure. She is the early warning system. If something goes wrong near the cord, Hollis will see it in the heart rate, the blood pressure, the breathing pattern before Callahan sees it in the wound. Jennings deserves a moment here because what she is doing this morning is harder than anyone in the room knows. She is 24 years old from Connecticut. She volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps in 1943. Her older brother, First Lieutenant James Jennings, was killed in Normandy in June 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day. He was 26. He died in the same hedgerow country where Klaus Brandt was shot and captured. Ruth does not know if her brother and Klaus ever occupied the same battlefield at the same time. She does not want to know. What she knows is that the young man on the operating table this morning wore the same uniform as the men who killed James. Ruth Jennings does not hate Klaus Brandt. She has used up all the energy that hatred requires. Losing James took everything she had, and what grew back in its place was not hatred, but a kind of exhausted clarity. She is a nurse. The man on the table is a patient. Her job is to hand instruments precisely when the surgeon needs them and to maintain a sterile field. That is all. That is enough. But when she lays out the instrument tray this morning, her hands shake. Just slightly. Just for a moment. Not enough for anyone to notice. She clenches her fists, once inhales through her nose, exhales through her mouth, her hands steady. She picks up the first retractor and places it exactly where it belongs. This is her near-failure moment. Not a dramatic collapse, not tears, just a tremor in the hands of a 24-year-old woman who lost her brother to the war and is now preparing to help save a man from the other side of it. She chooses duty over grief, protocol over pain. The same choice Callahan makes. The same choice Tanner makes. The same quiet, unremarkable, extraordinary choice that runs through this entire story like a thread you cannot see until you step back far enough. Marsh instructs Klaus to count backward from 10 in German. Avery, standing just outside the operating room door, has relayed this instruction. Klaus counts. 10, 9, 8, 7. He loses consciousness at 7. His left leg stops trembling for the first time since Callahan met him. Callahan scrubs in. He positions Klaus face down on the operating table with a bolster beneath his hips to slightly flex the lumbar spine, opening the spaces between the vertebrae. He marks the incision line directly over the bullet's location, guided by measurements from the X-ray films. The room is quiet. The overhead lights hum. Marsh monitors the ether flow and watches the breathing. Hollis watches the pulse and blood pressure gauges. Jennings stands at Callahan's right side with instruments ready. Everything that can be prepared has been prepared. Everything that can be controlled is controlled. What cannot be controlled is the bullet itself, what it has adhered to in 4 months, what tissue it has scarred to its surface, in which direction it will want to move when Callahan disturbs it. Callahan makes the incision, 5 inches along the midline through skin and subcutaneous tissue. The scalpel parts the skin cleanly. Blood wells along the incision line, and Jennings dabs it with gauze in a rhythm she and Callahan have developed over dozens of procedures together. He cuts, she clears. He cuts, she clears. It is a conversation without words. He reaches the muscle layer and begins the technique Davenport described, muscle splitting rather than cutting, separating the back muscles along their natural fiber direction using blunt dissection. His fingers press between the muscle bundles, easing them apart rather than severing them. This is slower than cutting, significantly slower. But cutting through muscle means cutting through blood vessels that feed the muscle, which means more bleeding, which means reduced visibility in the surgical field, which means increased risk when he reaches the bullet. Every decision in this surgery flows from one principle: protect the distance between the bullet and the canal. The tissue parts layer by layer. As he goes deeper, Callahan encounters what he expected but hoped would be less severe. Scar tissue, dense fibrous adhesive scar tissue that the body has been building around the bullet's track for 4 months. This is the body's natural response to a foreign object. Wall it off. Encase it. Bind it to everything around it. The scar tissue means that the bullet is not floating freely in soft tissue. It is cemented in place by fibrous bands that connect it to surrounding muscle fascia and potentially to the structures near the spinal column itself. Callahan works through the scar tissue with deliberate patience. Blunt dissection, where possible; sharp dissection, only where fibrous bands are too thick to separate by pressure alone. Each layer he frees brings the bullet fractionally closer to his instruments. Each layer also brings his instruments fractionally closer to the spinal canal. He is aware of both distances simultaneously. The distance to the bullet, which is shrinking, and the distance to the cord, which is also shrinking. His task is to close one distance without closing the other. 15 minutes into the deep dissection, Callahan feels the bullet before he sees it. His gloved fingertip contacts something hard and smooth at a depth of approximately 4 centimeters, slightly to the left of the midline. The sensation is unmistakable. Metal does not feel like tissue. It has a density, a coolness, even through the glove that the body cannot replicate. Callahan keeps his finger on the bullet and uses his other hand to place a sterile probe alongside it, verifying its orientation. The bullet's long axis runs slightly medially. Its nose points toward the spinal canal, exactly as the X-ray showed. The scar tissue has locked it in this position, angled inward, like a compass needle, pointing toward the one destination that cannot be allowed. Callahan places a narrow surgical clamp along the bullet's long axis from the lateral side. The clamp jaws close around the bullet with a soft metallic contact that Jennings can hear from where she stands. Callahan adjusts his grip, checks the alignment, checks that his extraction path follows the long axis away from the spine, not toward it. This is the moment. Everything before this has been preparation. Everything after this will be consequence. Between those two things is a single motion of Callahan's right hand. Jennings is absolutely still. Marsh watches the monitors. Hollis watches the monitors. The overhead light hums. The clock on the wall reads 9:17 in the morning. Callahan exhales slowly, tightens his grip on the clamp, and pulls in a single controlled movement along the axis he has set. The bullet comes free. It slides out of 4 months of scar tissue with a resistance that gives suddenly, and Callahan's hand moves back with the released momentum. He holds the clamp up. Between the jaws is a pistol bullet slightly deformed at the nose from its original impact, dark with oxidized blood and tissue fluid from 122 days inside a human body. Callahan looks at it for 1 second. Then he drops it into the collection tray with a small metallic sound that seems too quiet for what it represents. He immediately checks the surgical cavity for bleeding, inspects the tissue adjacent to the spinal canal. The dura, the outer membrane of the spinal cord, is visible at the medial edge of the cavity, a pale bluish-white surface, intact, no breach, no bleeding from the canal, no indication of penetration. The bullet came out and the canal is undisturbed. Callahan tells Marsh quietly, "It is out." Marsh nods. Hollis exhales. Jennings hands Callahan the irrigation syringe without being asked. But the surgery is not finished, and neither is the story, because Callahan picks up the bullet from the collection tray and holds it under the surgical light. He turns it slowly between his fingers, and something becomes immediately apparent that was not visible on the X-ray. The bullet is not an American caliber. The dimensions and shape are consistent with a 9mm parabellum round. This is the standard ammunition for German service pistols and submachine guns. Not American. German. Callahan shows it to Hollis. Hollis looks at it and says, "That is a German bullet." Callahan says, "Yes." The operating room is silent except for the hum of the lights and the slow rhythm of Klaus's anesthetized breathing. Callahan already knows what it most likely means. The entry wound on Klaus's back, which he examined during the preoperative assessment, is on the left posterior lower back, a location consistent with being shot from behind or from the left rear. During the chaotic retreat near St. Lo in July 1944, in the confusion of a unit shattering under fire, a German 9mm round entered Klaus Brandt's back from behind, not from the front where the Americans were, from behind where the Germans were. Callahan does not say anything else about it in the operating room. He closes the surgical wound in careful layers, placing a small drain to prevent fluid accumulation in the cavity where the bullet sat. Muscle layers, fascial layer, skin. Total surgery time is 1 hour and 40 minutes. He dictates his operative note while the details are fresh. Posterior approach. Successful bullet extraction without spinal canal violation. Bullet identified as 9mm parabellum caliber, consistent with German military ammunition. He hands the bullet in a labeled glass vial to Jennings and tells her to place it in Klaus Brandt's medical file. Jennings takes the vial. She holds it for a moment, feeling the slight weight of the bullet shift inside the glass. She looks at the young man still unconscious on the table, the young man whose back she just helped open and close, the young man who wore the same uniform as the soldiers who killed her brother James. Then she labels the vial carefully in her precise nurse's handwriting and places it in the file. Her hands do not shake. Callahan decides something else in that moment. He will tell Klaus what the bullet indicates when Klaus has recovered sufficiently. The information belongs to Klaus. It is his body, his wound, his 4 months of carrying something that was put there not by his enemy, but possibly by his own side. Whatever the circumstances were, he deserves to know. That afternoon, Callahan kept his promise to Bobby Tanner. He operated on Tanner's compound femur fracture in a procedure that took just under 2 hours. The surgery was straightforward, the kind Callahan had done hundreds of times. Tanner woke from anesthesia asking if the German kid was all right. Callahan told him the German kid was fine. Tanner said good, then asked when he could walk. Callahan said 6 weeks. Tanner said he could wait 6 weeks if the other guy could wait 4 months. If you are listening to this and this story is keeping you here, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories do not tell themselves. 6 hours after his own surgery, Klaus wakes from anesthesia in the recovery area. The first thing he does when he is conscious enough to communicate is move his left leg deliberately. He bends his knee, lifts his thigh from the bed surface. The movement is slow and unsteady from the anesthetic, but it is present and controlled. Callahan is in the recovery area when it happens. He watches and makes a note. Voluntary left lower extremity movement intact immediately post-operative. Klaus looks down at his own leg moving, then looks up at Callahan. He says 2 words in German. Avery translates. It moved. Callahan says, yes, it moved. Klaus closes his eyes, and something in his face releases. A tension that has been there since before Callahan met him, a tightness around the eyes and jaw that comes from watching your own body betray you and being unable to stop it. That tension dissolves. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for now. Over the following days, Callahan monitors the neurological recovery with the precision of a man who understands that the surgery was only half the battle. He tests sensation and reflexes twice daily. The left thigh numbness begins improving on the second post-operative day. By day 3, Klaus can feel pinprick sensation equally on both sides. The diminished knee reflex returns it to normal by day 4. The trembling stops completely by day 2. The compressed nerve root is recovering as the pressure is relieved. On day 4, Callahan tells Klaus the neurological signs are all trending toward normal. Full recovery is likely if the trajectory continues. Then Callahan tells Klaus about the bullet. He sits beside the hospital bed with Avery translating and places the glass vial in Klaus's hands. He explains that the bullet is a German 9mm round, not American, and what that most likely means about the direction it came from and the circumstances of the wounding. Klaus holds the vial. He looks at the bullet inside it for a long time. The overhead light in the hospital ward catches the glass and throws a small, bright reflection onto the bedsheet. Klaus turns the vial, slowly watching the dark, deformed bullet roll inside. Then he speaks through Avery. He says he has sometimes wondered, in the chaos of that retreat with firing from multiple directions, he felt the impact from behind and never fully understood it. He never knew who fired. He may never know precisely. Then Klaus says the words that Callahan will remember long after he has forgotten the details of the surgery itself. I was shot. I carried the bullet for 4 months. The Americans took it out. Those are the facts. The rest is something I cannot know. Callahan nods. He does not press further. He leaves the vial with Klaus. But the vial does not stay a private matter for long. Klaus carries it in his shirt pocket when he is discharged from the hospital ward and returned to the general prisoner population. Other prisoners in his barracks ask about it. He tells them the story plainly. shot in the back during the retreat near St. Lo. 4 months with the bullet migrating toward his spine, the leg going numb. A surgeon at this camp who looked at the x-ray and operated the next morning. He shows him the bullet. Some prisoners look at the caliber without comment. One prisoner, a former infantryman from Hamburg, examines the bullet carefully and says, "That came from behind you." Fine. Klaus says yes. The Hamburg man says nothing more and hands it back. Some truths in a prisoner barracks in 1944 are spoken and then allowed to sit without further discussion. But not everyone lets the truth sit quietly, and not everyone wants Klaus telling this story. Stefan Vogt has been watching. Vogt is 34 years old and a former sergeant in the Afrika Korps captured in Tunisia in 1943. He has been at Camp Herne for over a year. In that time, Vogt has become one of the hard Nazi elements who control the camp's internal politics through intimidation, propaganda, secret disciplinary hearings, and a blacklist of prisoners deemed disloyal to the Reich. This is not fiction. The historical record of Camp Herne documents exactly this pattern. Nazi loyalists infiltrated the camp postal service, compiled lists of anti-Nazi prisoners, conducted underground tribunals, and enforced obedience through fear. In December 1943, a German prisoner named Hugo Kraus was beaten to death by 7 Nazi prisoners at Camp Herne for openly criticizing the Third Reich. Kraus's skull was cracked, both arms broken. He died 6 days later. No one in his barracks dared come to his aid. Vogt does not use his fists. He is more intelligent than that and therefore more dangerous. He uses pressure, rumors, social isolation. He tells prisoners that after the war there will be an accounting. Those who collaborated with the Americans, who showed gratitude to the enemy, who forgot their duty as German soldiers, will be remembered. Their names are written down. Vogt hears Klaus telling his story, hears Klaus saying that an American surgeon saved his leg, hears Klaus showing the German bullet to other prisoners, and Vogt sees in this a threat. Not to Germany, to Vogt's authority, because Klaus's story told simply and without embellishment suggests something that Vogt cannot tolerate. It suggests that the enemy showed more care for Klaus than Klaus's own side did. Vogt approaches Klaus in the barracks one evening. The conversation starts quietly. "I hear you have been showing your trophy to everyone," Vogt says, "the American souvenir." "It is not a souvenir," Klaus says. "It is a bullet that was in my back for 4 months. And you tell everyone the Americans are heroes for taking it out. You are becoming their propaganda puppet brand. I tell what happened, nothing more." Vogt smiles without warmth. "What happened? You know the caliber of that bullet, yes, 9mm. German. You know what that means. I know what it might mean." Vogt lowers his voice. "At St. Lo, when the retreat order came, there were men who ran before they were told to run. Men who turned their backs before they had permission to turn their backs. And there were men who dealt with cowards the way cowards have always been dealt with." Klaus stands very still. His heart rate rises, but his face does not change. And in that stillness, something surfaces from the locked room in his mind. The muzzle flash, the figure in the German uniform, the weapon pointed in his direction. For the first time since Normandy, Klaus does not push the image away. He lets it sit there fully formed in the front of his consciousness. He looks at it the way a man looks at something he has been afraid of and finds that the looking does not kill him. "I am not saying I know who shot you," Vogt says, "but I am saying that if you continue praising the Americans in this camp, there will be people who remember your name, and not fondly." This is a double threat. On the surface, Vogt is warning Klaus about post-war reprisals from Nazi networks. Underneath, Vogt is suggesting something darker, that the bullet in Klaus's back was not an accident of chaotic retreat, but a deliberate act, a punishment for someone perceived as a coward or a potential deserter. And that Vogt, or someone in Vogt's network, knows the circumstances. Klaus is left with a question he has buried since Normandy, now dragged into the light by a man who uses truth as a weapon. Was the bullet an accident in the fog of war, or did someone in his own unit put it there on purpose? He does not have the answer. He may never have the answer. But he discovers standing in this barracks with Vogt's threat hanging in the air, that not knowing is something he can carry. He has carried a bullet for 4 months. He can carry a question for longer. The next morning, Klaus sits in the camp kitchen where Sergeant Walter Cope puts a plate in front of him. Bacon, eggs, biscuits. The bacon is crisp and curled at the edges, fried in a cast-iron skillet that Cope has seasoned over 20 years of cooking, first for ranch hands in Oklahoma, then for soldiers and prisoners in Texas. The smell fills the kitchen. That particular smell of American bacon, smoky and salty and rich with rendered fat, a smell that carries in it Saturday mornings and farmhouse kitchens, and a way of life that Klaus has only known for a few weeks, but that already feels like something important. Klaus takes a bite of the bacon, stops. Cope looks at him. What? Avery translates. Klaus says, in Germany we smoke sausages. We think we know how to smoke meat. He looks at the bacon. But this is a religion. Cope, for the first time since Klaus began working in the kitchen, laughs. A short, quiet Texas laugh that does not require many facial muscles. Then he puts 2 more strips of bacon on Klaus's plate without a word. This is a small moment. It is not the climax of the story. It is not a turning point. But it is the kind of moment that audiences remember because it is real. A young German prisoner threatened by his own countrymen, carrying a bullet from his own army, in a glass vial eating American bacon in a Texas kitchen and calling it a religion. And a Texas cook who responds not with words, but with 2 extra strips of bacon. This is mercy in its smallest, most ordinary, most human form. Not a grand gesture, not a speech about brotherhood. Just bacon on a plate from a man who figures that a kid who has been through what this kid has been through could use a little extra. But across the mess hall, Vogt is watching. And Vogt does not forget. Vogt never forgets. The threat does not come all at once. It comes the way Vogt does everything, gradually, methodically, through channels that leave no fingerprints. In the days after their conversation, Klaus notices the changes. Conversations stop when he enters the barracks. The seat beside him in the mess hall stays empty more often than not. A prisoner he had been friendly with, a mechanic from Stuttgart, avoids eye contact and moves to a different work detail without explanation. The Stuttgart man does not explain because the explanation would require admitting that Vogt told him associating with Klaus Brandt would be remembered after the war. Klaus understands what is happening. He has watched Vogt operate for weeks. The whisper campaigns. The slow strangulation of social contact. The careful construction of fear around a single target until the target either submits or breaks. Klaus has seen other prisoners submit. A sailor from Kiel who had said something positive about American food was visited by Vogt's people and the next day stopped speaking to anyone outside his immediate bunk group. A teacher from Munich who had enrolled in an English language class offered by the camp education program quietly dropped out after receiving an anonymous note in his footlocker. Klaus does not submit. This is not because he is braver than the sailor or the teacher. It is because he has already survived something that Vogt cannot replicate. He has lain on an operating table while a man he had never met before reached into his back and pulled a bullet from millimeters away from the cord that controls his legs. After that, a whisper campaign in a prison barracks does not carry the same weight. One evening, Vogt comes to Klaus's bunk with 3 other prisoners. Vogt says loud enough for the entire barracks to hear, "Brandt, the disciplinary committee wants to speak with you about your conduct." There is no official disciplinary committee. This is the underground Nazi tribunal system that the historical record of Camp Hearn documents in detail. A shadow court where loyalty is measured and punishment is assigned outside the sight of American guards. The kind of system that killed Hugo Kraus in December 1943. Klaus stands up. He reaches into his shirt pocket and takes out the glass vial. The small dark bullet rolls inside it as he holds it up to the barracks light. He looks at Vogt. Then he looks around the barracks at the faces watching him. Some hostile, some frightened, some carefully blank. Klaus speaks. His voice is not loud, but it is clear, and in the silence of that barracks, clear is enough. This bullet is 9mm parabellum, German ammunition. It entered my back from behind at St. Lo while I was running toward our own lines. I carried it for 4 months. At every transit stop, the medics read my file, checked my pulse, and moved me along. The 8th doctor, an American surgeon here in Texas, looked at the x-ray and scheduled surgery for the next morning. He called a specialist 500 miles away and wrote down instructions for a procedure he had never performed before. He operated the next day. He pulled this bullet out of 4mm from my spinal cord. I am standing here on both legs because of him. Klaus holds the vial higher so the light catches it. You can think whatever you want about that. The silence that follows is not the silence of agreement or disagreement. It is the silence of men hearing a truth that is too simple to argue with and too complete to add anything to. Klaus was shot from behind. He carried the bullet. The Americans took it out. Those are facts. They sit in the air of the barracks like stones placed on a table, immovable and without commentary. Vogt looks at Klaus for a long moment. Then he looks around the barracks, measuring the room the way a man measures a wind that has shifted against him. No one moves to support Vogt. No one moves to support Klaus either. But the absence of support for Vogt is in this environment a defeat. Vogt's power depends on unanimous compliance. One man standing with a glass vial telling a story that cannot be denied is enough to crack that unanimity. Vogt turns and walks away. He does not concede. Men like Vogt never concede. But he recognizes a position that cannot be taken by the tools he uses, and he withdraws to ground where his methods still work. He will continue his campaigns against other targets. He will continue compiling his lists. But Klaus Brandt, the boy with the German bullet in a glass vial, becomes a story that moves through the barracks on its own without Klaus's help, told and retold by prisoners who were there that evening and who saw a 19-year-old hold up the evidence of his own wounding and refuse to be ashamed of being saved. The former infantryman from Hamburg, the one who had examined the bullet and said, "That came from behind you," finds Klaus in the kitchen the next morning. He does not say anything about the confrontation with Vogt. He simply sits down next to Klaus at the work table, where Klaus is peeling potatoes for the midday meal and begins peeling alongside him. They work in silence for 20 minutes. Then the Hamburg man says, without looking up from his potato, "My brother was shot at Stalingrad, from behind, during a retreat. Same as you. He did not make it." Klaus says nothing. There is nothing to say. The Hamburg man finishes his potato and moves on. But sitting beside Klaus in the kitchen the morning after Vogt's confrontation is a statement of its own made in the only language that a prison barracks understands. Several weeks pass. Klaus has settled into a rhythm at Camp Hearn that bears no resemblance to anything he imagined when he was drafted at 17. He works in the kitchen under Sergeant Walter Cope. He has learned to smoke brisket, the Texas way low-heat mesquite wood, 12 hours of patience. Cope has taught him the way Cope teaches everything by demonstration and repetition, rather than explanation. Cope puts a piece of meat on the smoker, tends it for 12 hours, and expects Klaus to watch, remember, and replicate. Klaus, with the precise observational mind of a watchmaker's son, watches, remembers, and replicates. He notes the exact color of the smoke that indicates the correct temperature. He notes the flexibility of the meat when pressed at the 4-hour mark versus the 8-hour mark versus the 12-hour mark. Cope tells Callahan that Klaus is one of the best workers in the food preparation detail and that if the boy were not a prisoner, Cope would hire him. But the rhythm of Camp Hearn is about to be interrupted by something larger than any individual story. The war in Europe is ending. In the weeks after the confrontation with Vogt, something unexpected happens with Captain Vernon Slade. It begins with paperwork, as most things in Slade's world do. As the camp's administrative officer, Slade reviews medical reports as part of his routine duties. Among them is Callahan's operative note from Klaus's surgery. Slade reads through the standard surgical language, the approach, the dissection, the extraction. Then he reaches the line that stops him. Bullet identified as 9mm parabellum caliber, consistent with German military ammunition. Slade reads the line again. German military ammunition, not American. The prisoner was shot by his own side. Slade sits at his desk for a long time. The office is quiet. Through the window he can see the prisoner compound where German POWs are walking between barracks in the thin winter sunlight. He watches them without really seeing them. Then Slade does something he has not done since receiving the telegram about David. He opens the bottom drawer of his desk where he keeps a folder that he does not look at often. Inside the folder is the casualty report for his son. First Lieutenant David Slade, killed in action, Anzio, Italy, January 1944. Slade has read this report perhaps 50 times. He has memorized every line. But today he is reading it for a specific detail that he has always known but never connected to anything outside his own grief. The report states that David's position was hit by artillery fire during a German counterattack. But a supplementary note added weeks later after investigation indicates that the artillery round that killed David was identified as German ordnance fired from a position that had been recently occupied by Italian forces allied with Germany. The round may have been a misdirected German shell targeting Allied positions, but falling short onto an area where German and Italian lines overlapped. Friendly fire. Not certain, but consistent with the evidence. Slade closes the folder. He sits in his office as the afternoon light changes angle through the window. His son died at Anzio, possibly killed by a German shell that missed its target. Klaus Brandt was shot at St. Lo by a German bullet that hit him from behind. Two young men on opposite sides of the war, both wounded or killed, not by the enemy they faced, but by the chaos and incompetence and blind violence of their own side. Slade finds Callahan in the camp hospital that evening. Their conversation is short and unlike any conversation they have had before. "I read your surgical report," Slade says. "The bullet was German. 9mm parabellum," Callahan confirms. "Entry wound from behind, consistent with friendly fire during a disorganized retreat." Slade is quiet. Then he speaks in a voice that Callahan has never heard from him. Not the clipped, controlled voice of the administrative officer. Something raw, something that has been locked in the same drawer as David's casualty report. "My son David, Anzio. I always said the Germans killed him. But the supplementary report says the shell that hit his position was German ordnance that fell short, possibly aimed at Allied lines but landing on a mixed position. Friendly fire." Slade pauses. "Same as this boy." Callahan does not speak. There are moments when silence is more respectful than any words, and this is one of them. "I have hated them for killing my son," Slade says. "But it turns out my son may have been killed by the same thing that nearly killed their boy. A round from his own side that went wrong." Slade looks out the window at the darkening Texas sky. "I'm not saying I forgive anyone. I am just saying I do not know who to hate anymore." Callahan will never repeat this conversation to anyone. It is not his to share, but he notices in the weeks that follow small changes in the way Slade administers the camp. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would appear in any report. The Thanksgiving meat allocation for the prisoner compound is approved without reduction. A request for additional blankets in the prisoner barracks, which had been sitting on Slade's desk for 2 weeks, is approved the day after their conversation. These are not acts of generosity. They are acts of a man whose certainty has been fractured by a 9mm bullet in a glass vial, and who is quietly, without admitting it to anyone, rebuilding his understanding of the world to accommodate the fracture. If this story has touched you, share it. Each share helps these untold stories find the audience they deserve. And they deserve one. May 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. At Camp Hearn, the news arrives and produces a strange and complicated silence in the prisoner compound. Some prisoners weep. Some stare at the ground. Some simply continue whatever they were doing, peeling potatoes, sweeping barracks, floors, as though the end of everything they once knew is best met with the continuation of routine. Klaus is in the kitchen when the news comes. Cope tells him plainly without ceremony. "War is over in Europe. Germany surrendered." Klaus nods. He continues slicing onions for the evening meal. His eyes water, but that might be the onions. Letters arrive from Nuremberg in the weeks that follow, and they bring news that Klaus has feared. The Allied bombing raids of January and February 1945 devastated the city. Nuremberg, once the site of the massive Nazi Party rallies, was targeted systematically. The medieval old town was largely destroyed. The family apartment was heavily damaged, but still standing. His mother and Willie survived. His father was injured by debris, a cut across his forehead that left a scar but recovered. Willie writes that the bakery where he was apprenticing was destroyed completely. There is no work. Food is scarce. The city is rubble and dust and the smell of things that should not be burning. Willie is 17 now, 2 years older than when Klaus last saw him, and his letters have the careful, measured tone of someone who has grown up faster than anyone should. Klaus reads the letter in the kitchen after hours. And for the first time since arriving at Camp Hearn, he cries. Not in the barracks where other prisoners might see. In the kitchen alone, sitting on an overturned crate beside the stove that still radiates warmth from the dinner service. He cries quietly the way men cry when they have been holding something for a very long time and the container finally cracks. Cope finds him. Cope does not ask what happened. He does not offer words of comfort. He places a tin mug of hot coffee in front of Klaus on the prep table and walks outside. The coffee sits there steaming in the quiet kitchen. Klaus picks it up after a while and drinks it. It is black and strong and made the way Cope makes everything without fuss and with complete competence. It is perhaps the most compassionate cup of coffee anyone has ever made for Klaus Brandt, and it is delivered without a single word. December 1945. Klaus is approved for repatriation. Before he leaves Camp Hearn, he goes to the camp hospital to see Callahan one last time. He asks Avery to translate something specific. And Avery, who has translated hundreds of routine medical conversations over the past year, understands immediately that this one is different. Klaus says, "I know you operated on many prisoners. I know I was one case on a long list. But I want you to know that when I grabbed your wrist that first morning, I had been asking for help for 4 months, and no one had helped. You walked into the room, and I thought, this is my last chance. If this man says no or says, wait, I do not know what happens to me. You said yes immediately. I want you to know that I understand what that meant." Callahan listens. Then he says through Avery, "You did not need to grab my wrist. The x-ray would have told me everything. But I understand why you did." Klaus nods. He reaches into his pocket and hands Callahan a small, folded piece of paper. On it, in careful German handwriting, is Klaus's home address in Nuremberg in a single line. "If you ever come to Germany, my family would like to cook you a proper meal." Callahan takes the paper. He reads it. He folds it and puts it in the breast pocket of his uniform. He does not know that this piece of paper will sit in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, that he will never go to Germany, and that the paper will outlast him. Callahan says 3 words. He says them in English, slowly, and Avery does not translate because the words are simple enough that Klaus understands them on his own. Walk on both. Klaus boards a transport ship in New York in late December 1945. In his coat pocket is the glass vial with the bullet. In a sealed envelope is Callahan's surgical documentation. And in his mind, 3 English words that need no translation. He walks down the gangway to the ship's deck. He feels the wooden planks beneath his left foot. He feels them, every plank, every vibration. The cold Atlantic wind against his left thigh. He feels it, every gust. He climbs the ship's ladder without his left knee trembling. His left leg bears his weight, bends, extends, carries him up each rung, the way a leg is supposed to work, the way a leg works when the nerve that controls it is not being slowly crushed by a piece of metal that no longer lives there. These sensations, which 19-year-olds take entirely for granted, are to Klaus Brandt the specific physical undeniable evidence of what was done for him by a surgeon in Texas who reached into his back and pulled out the thing that was slowly killing his ability to walk and left everything else intact. Klaus arrives in Europe in early 1946. Like most German prisoners repatriated from the United States, he is not sent directly home. He is held in France for several months of labor, repairing roads and clearing rubble from bombed towns before being released to return to Germany. This is the standard process documented in historical records. Approximately 50,000 German POWs were repatriated per month beginning in late 1945, most routed through labor details in France and Britain before their final return. Klaus reaches Nuremberg in the spring of 1946. The city he left as a 17-year-old apprentice watchmaker is almost unrecognizable. The medieval old town with its half-timbered houses and narrow cobblestone streets is a landscape of broken walls and empty window frames. The great Nazi rally grounds where hundreds of thousands once marched in torch-lit processions are cratered and silent. The courthouse where the Nuremberg trials are prosecuting the architects of the Reich is surrounded by military police and barbed wire. Klaus finds his family. His mother is thinner, her hair grayer, her eyes carrying a weariness that goes deeper than tired. His father still repairs watches in a small room of the damaged apartment, working with steady hands on mechanisms that require the same precision, whether the world outside is whole or shattered. Willie, now 17, is taller than Klaus remembers, and quieter in a way that is not shyness, but something learned. The war taught Willie that silence is safer than speech, and he has not fully unlearned the lesson. Klaus does not speak much about Camp Hearn. He says he was wounded, he was treated well. He places the glass vial with the bullet on the shelf in the bedroom he shares with Willie. When someone asks about it, he tells the short version. When no one asks, the vial sits on the shelf, reflecting the afternoon light through the window of a Nuremberg apartment that is damaged but standing like everything else that survived. Klaus does not become a professional chef, though Cope's lessons stay with him for life. He follows his father into watchmaking. The precise hands, the logical mind, the patience for small mechanisms. He opens his own shop in 1955 as Nuremberg rebuilds around him. The shop is small on a side street near the castle, and behind the counter on a shelf between antique clocks sits a glass vial containing a dark deformed 9mm bullet. Callahan retires from the Army in 1960 after 20 years of service. He settles in San Antonio, Texas. His daughter Catherine, born in 1942, has trained as a nurse following in her father's medical footsteps without ever knowing the specific story that made him sit at his desk late at night reviewing X-ray films by lamplight. Callahan never tells his family the names of specific patients. He speaks about Camp Hearn in general terms. I operated on many people. Some were American soldiers, some were prisoners. All of them were patients. In the drawer of his desk is the folded piece of paper with a Nuremberg address written in careful German handwriting. He never goes to Germany. He never writes to the address, but he never throws the paper away. Callahan dies in 1987. He is 71 years old. His daughter Catherine inherits his papers, his medals, and the contents of his desk. She finds the Nuremberg address and does not know what it means. She puts it back in the drawer. Klaus Brandt dies in March 1989 in Nuremberg. He is 64 years old. Heart disease. Willie, now 60, is the one who goes through his brother's belongings. In the bedroom on the shelf where it has sat for 43 years, Willie finds the glass vial. Beside it in a small box is the sealed envelope containing Callahan's surgical documentation unopened since Klaus brought it home in 1946. Willie opens the envelope for the first time. He reads the operative note. His English is limited but sufficient. Successful surgical extraction of retained projectile. No spinal canal violation. Bullet identified as 9mm parabellum caliber, consistent with German military ammunition. At the bottom of the note, a line that serves as both signature and summary. Extracted by Major Edward Callahan, Camp Hearn, Texas, November 1944. Willie holds the glass vial up to the window light. The bullet inside is small and dark and weighs almost nothing. He turns the vial the way Klaus must have turned it thousands of times over 43 years, watching the bullet roll from one end to the other, a tiny piece of metal that once sat 4mm from the cord that controlled his brother's legs. Willie writes a letter. He addresses it to Camp Hearn, Texas, United States. The letter is returned. Camp Hearn closed in January 1946, more than 40 years ago. The buildings were sold as surplus. The land returned to the Texas prairie. There is nothing at that address anymore but foundations and weeds and the faint outlines of where barracks once stood. Willie does not give up. He is 60 years old and his brother is dead, and there is a glass vial on his kitchen table and a name on a surgical note. And he has decided that this name deserves to know what happened to the boy whose back it reached into 44 years ago. Willie writes to the United States Department of Defense requesting information about Major Edward Callahan, Surgeon, Camp Hearn, Texas, 1944. Weeks later, he receives a reply with an address in San Antonio, Texas. The letter explains that Major Callahan is deceased. He passed away in 1987. But his daughter, Catherine Callahan, resides at the listed address. Willie writes to Catherine. He writes in careful English, assembled with a dictionary and patience. He explains who he is, who Klaus was, what happened in November 1944 in a camp hospital in Texas. He encloses a photograph of Klaus taken in the 1970s, standing in his watch shop, a middle-aged man with reading glasses and steady hands, the glass vial visible on the shelf behind him. Catherine receives the letter on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1990. She reads it at her kitchen table in San Antonio. She reads it twice. Then she goes to her father's study, which she has kept largely as he left it, and opens the desk drawer. The folded piece of paper is where it has always been. She unfolds it, German handwriting faded but legible, an address in Nuremberg, and a single line that she now for the first time understands. If you ever come to Germany, my family would like to cook you a proper meal. Catherine picks up the telephone and dials the international number that Willie included in his letter. It rings 4 times. A man answers. His voice is older, cautious, speaking German. Herr Brandt, Catherine says, this is Catherine Callahan. I am Edward Callahan's daughter. I received your letter. The conversation lasts 40 minutes. They do not share a language fluently. Catherine speaks English. Willie speaks German with fragments of English assembled over a lifetime. But they understand each other in the way that people understand each other when the thing they are talking about matters more than the words they use to talk about it. Catherine tells Willie about her father, how he never spoke about specific patients, how he kept the paper with the Nuremberg address for 42 years without ever visiting or writing. How he described Camp Hearn only in general terms, but sometimes late at night would sit in his study with the desk lamp on, looking at something in the drawer that he never showed anyone. Willie tells Catherine about Klaus, how he rarely spoke about the war, how he became a watchmaker like their father, how the glass vial sat on the shelf for 43 years, explained briefly to anyone who asked, and otherwise left in silence, how Klaus walked without a limp for the rest of his life, how he sometimes on cold winter mornings would press his hand against his left thigh as though confirming something, confirming that the feeling was still there, that the leg still worked, that the 4mm had held. Then Willie says the sentence he prepared before making the call. He says it in English, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man speaking words he has practiced. My brother always said that the steadiest hands he ever knew belonged to a doctor in Texas. Catherine is silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. When she speaks, her voice has the particular quality of someone who is smiling and crying at the same time. My father always said that the smartest patient he ever treated was a 19-year-old boy who understood that 10% was better than 100%. They stay on the phone a while longer, not because there is more information to exchange, but because hanging up feels like closing something that has been open for 44 years. When they finally say goodbye, it is with the understanding that something has been completed. Not resolved because the full truth of who fired that bullet in Normandy was never known and will never be known, but completed in the sense that the two families connected by a surgery in a Texas prison camp have now spoken to each other, have now confirmed that the surgery mattered, that the bullet in the glass vial traveled from a body to a shelf, to a kitchen table, to a telephone conversation across the Atlantic Ocean, and that at each stop it carried the same simple, irrefutable message. The bullet weighed less than 8 grams. It lived in Klaus Brown's body for 4 months in a glass vial on a shelf for 43 years and in the memory of 2 families for the rest of their lives. 7 doctors read his file and moved him along. The 8th looked at the x-ray and stood still for 1 minute. Then he scheduled surgery. Then he called a specialist 500 miles away. Then he sat at his desk at 10 o'clock at night and read the instructions one more time, not because he did not remember them, but because he wanted his hands to remember them. 4mm, thinner than the width of a pencil. That is the distance between walking on both legs and never walking again. Between feeling the deck of a ship beneath your left foot and feeling nothing. Between a story that lasts 44 years and a story that ends on an operating table in Texas. There are things smaller than the width of a pencil that change everything. And there are hands in Texas in 1944 steady enough to make 4mm the longest and most important distance in one man's life.